Good evening and a very warm welcome on behalf of the Jewish Historical Society of England Leeds branch and on behalf of Milim to this evening's presentation. And it's a great pleasure to welcome you all back after our short break. Our series of online talks and conversations continues with our guest Gavin Schaffer. I'll introduce Gavin in just a moment. Please do ask questions. You can do this by typing whatever you'd like to ask into the Q&A facility on your screen. As always, we will try our best to get through as many of your questions as we can. Let me also draw your attention to the chat facility, which will allow you to send a message to all of the other participants on this webinar, should you wish to do so. And finally, this event is being recorded. It will appear on our website at milim.org.uk in the coming day or so. There you will find recordings of other past events, as well as details of our future programme for which you can book tickets. And so to our speaker this evening. Gavin Schaffer is a social and cultural historian specialising in the history of race and immigration in the 20th century. He's Professor of British History at the University of Birmingham. He spent several years researching the place of race in science, which led to his 2008 monograph, Racial Science and British Society. Subsequently, he has written a book about racism and the media, looking in detail at television attempts to deal with multiculturalism in the 1960s and 1970s. Gavin is also interested in the history of immigrants and minorities, the history of comedy, the social history of modern warfare, and of course, Jewish history. This evening, he is speaking about being frum in post-war Britain. Gavin, we're eager to hear your words of wisdom, so over to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for having me. I'm not so sure about words of wisdom, but I will read a paper this evening, which is from new research I'm doing, which is a post-war history of British Jews. And this area of the book is looking at changes in religious practice. I want to start off by talking about an exchange that took place on radio in 1982. It was December 1982. And this exchange took place between the Rabbi of St. John's Wood, the Orthodox Shul, Glaswegian Cyril Harris, and Hugo Gryn, Holocaust survivor and Rabbi of Britain's first Reform congregation, the West London. This was on Michael Friedland's weekly Sunday morning show on Radio London, You Don't Have to Be Jewish. Friedland had invited the two prominent rabbis, who were both regular contributors to his show, to discuss critical comments made by the Manchester Beth Din about the legitimacy of Jewish rites of passage as they were carried out by Reform Judaism, especially relating to marriage, divorce, conversion. The Beth Din, and Friedland paraphrased, had made the case that Reform marriage wasn't worth the paper it was written on. In a tense conversation, Cyril Harris told Friedland that the Beth Din had been right to take a firm position. It was a stance, he argued, which reflected, and I quote, the vast majority of traditional rabbis in this country who utterly repudiate the violence which Reform and liberal so-called rabbis are doing in the name of Jewish law and Jewish tradition, end quote. In response, Hugo Gryn, who was clearly upset by the attack on his status and his community, said that he could only understand it as the sin of sinat chinam, of causeless hate. As the conversation turned ugly, Gryn characterized the Orthodox position as an outbreak of Ayatollahism, while Harris said that some Reform converts didn't know the difference between an aleph and a swastika. Comments which you can hear Hugo Gryn saying in the background, oh, that's nasty. While Harris argued that research in other countries had indicated that Reform was a passport out of Judaism, Gryn highlighted many generations of the same family who had frequented his shul. The Orthodox position on Reform, notably towards converts, I think Gryn was talking about, he said, it's not a million miles from being racist. The tone of this discussion was brutal. But what really caused upset was the Orthodox refusal to recognize the theological integrity of non-Orthodox Judaism in any sense. To Harrison and those like him, Reform Judaism was a vacuous aberration, quote, an abnormality that we would rather do without. In the aftermath of this broadcast, Grin expressed, and I quote him, my profound sense of hurt. On the Orthodox side, however, attempts were made to play down the row as a normal part of Jewish life. In private comments, which served, possibly not inadvertently, to legitimize the Reform point of view by stressing the family nature of the argument, the Chief Rabbi, so this in 82 is Jacobowitz, had said that the broadcast had been, and I quote, very mild as compared with the confrontations between the Belt, Satmar and Lubavitch, which from time to time had turned New York into a battlefield. Perhaps more important, however, was the Orthodox point of view that this was an argument that needed to be had. There was no point, Jeffrey Cohen asserted, Rabbi Jeffrey Cohen, in covering over the cracks that existed. In fact, the broadcast was one of a myriad of attacks that were made on progressive Judaism by Orthodox activists and rabbis in post-war Britain. To Harris and many others, British Jewish conservatism in the face of reform had been the community's trump card over generations, and now they feared the traditional loyalty of British Jews to Orthodox Judaism was in some jeopardy. Arguably, this Orthodox anxiety was overstated. Since the first British Reform congregation had opened its doors in the 1840s, the great majority of synagogue attending Jews in Britain had continued to associate with Orthodox communities of one shade or another, even though progressive Judaism did grow rapidly from the 1940s. Research in 1970 showed that over 3/4 of synagogue attending Jews in London were still members of Orthodox communities, statistics that have changed but have only changed slowly since then. Commenting in 1977, Jacobowitz asserted with confidence that Anglo Jewry was, quote, the most stable community in the world and one that remained staunchly traditional and staunchly Orthodox. And yet, the post-war period is one that is frequently described by historians of post-war Jewry as a period of schism and a period of polarization, during which a diversity of practice and belief undermined any sense of unity. Jeffrey Alderman, for example, has argued that by the beginning of the 21st century, Anglo Jewry had come apart. According to this kind of thinking, British Jewry, moderate, middle of the road, Orthodox, was being pulled in two opposite directions by progressive Judaism on one hand and by more conservative and strict Orthodoxy on the other hand. Pulling away from the center was comprehensible to Emanuel Jacobowitz in terms of children looking for different avenues of Judaism from their parents. The children of United Synagogue members, he said, will either wear kippot and be likely recruits for enrollment in Jewish day schools, or they will lounge around in coffee bars and eventually wear off their Jewish identity to a point of complete disengagement. Jacobowitz thought they'd go kind of one way or the other. Understanding what happened in post-war Jewry, though, really more than any other factor, you have to understand the arrival of refugee Jews. And I'm talking here specifically about the refugees from Nazism and some of the refugees from Eastern Europe after the war. Because these refugees brought with them and often tried really hard to retain a different set of traditions and practices. And of course, you know, the whole history of modern British Jewry is a history of immigration, the Ashkenazi immigration in the 19th century. So that what Aubrey Newman describes as the Grand Dukes all of the United Synagogue had been under pressure from more religious immigrants since the turn of the century, if not before. But the arrival of the refugees from Nazism and subsequently from the Eastern Bloc accelerated shifts both to the progressive and to stricter orthodoxy. As Freud Candle has said, it strengthened the outer poles of Anglo Jewry. And it wasn't, of course, only the Orthodox community who benefited from these refugees. Jonathan Romain and Anne Kirshner said there were 35 Reform rabbis among the refugees from Nazism, and their arrival in Britain substantially fueled progressive expansion, providing a new quality and quantity of leadership, which really, I mean, that enables new communities to start, it enables small communities to start. And armed with this new strength, progressive Judaism grew quickly in post-war Britain. It articulated different priorities and perspectives on Judaism and offered a new home for Jews who, for a variety of reasons, didn't feel represented by or aligned with Orthodox practice. This lecture tonight will explore this story of polarization through an analysis both of British Orthodoxy and of the Reform movement in post-war Britain, focusing on particular on the largely fraught relations between the two, of which we've already seen a little bit. Ultimately, what I want to do is I want to question what this pulling in different directions might tell us about the changing nature of British Jewishness and whether polarization as an idea is the best way to understand it. Because while it is arguable that strictly Orthodox and progressive communities benefited from the arrival of refugees and grew at the expense of mainstream Jewish practice, it's similarly possible to argue that a set of common concerns and similar practices and similar ways of thinking have underwritten these changes in a way that's led me to question whether British Jews are now quite as different from one another as they sometimes think. So understanding the development of more Orthodox Jews, and I'm going to use this term. Obviously, the term Orthodox is a very it's not a precise term, and I'm not going to use the term Haredi. I'm not going to use the term. I'm not going to talk about Hasidic. I'm not going to use the term ultra Orthodox. I'm going to talk about Orthodoxy. But when I'm talking about Orthodoxy, I'm talking about Jews emerging to the religious side of the United Synagogue. And make of that what you will, and I'm happy to take comments on doing that. But anyway, so Jewish immigrants from religious communities in Europe, and again now I'm talking about the 19th century immigrants, were frequently dissatisfied by the experience of the Anglo-Jewish synagogue. There was a deep fear and an anxiety that British Judaism was lax, inadequate, lacking the appropriate rigor and the appropriate devotion. British synagogues were often administered by lay leaders, men who was not so much religious as well established, dedicated to their communities. But for devotional Jews, this kind of leadership sometimes didn't sit well. And as a result of their anxieties, a whole host of new synagogues and institutions were created by immigrants who didn't feel at home or feel that their faith was safe within mainstream British Orthodoxy. In the first instance, many established small separate congregations, often in private houses, where they could pray without compromise in an atmosphere more akin to their pre-immigration congregations. Unaffiliated, usually small, congregations such as these, which were often named after immigrants' areas or towns where they came from, survived through membership subscription, which often didn't stretch far enough, at least initially, to pay for a full-time rabbi or for substantial premises. But with the support of Samuel Montague, many such communities affiliated with the new Federation of Synagogues from 1887, a grouping which enabled immigrant shuls access to new funds for development and access to a burial society, and enabled them to assert more of a voice in Jewish affairs in Britain. By the interwar period, the Federation had become the largest synagogal body in the country, although the United Synagogue would come on to get its supremacy back. These new voices in British Jewry called for higher standards of Jewish practice. In 1891, members of two new small congregations came together to establish the Chevre Maxike Chadash to express concerns about the standard of Shechita, as supervised by the Chief Rabbi. And failure to agree led to establishment of a separate congregation with its own Shechita, a marker of the willingness of the immigrants to go out on their own where they felt that their religious practice might be threatened. A generation later, in 1925, Jews in Manchester went on to establish their own Maxike Chadash organization and later a synagogue for pretty similar reasons. Other significant new groupings similarly adopted a more orthodox Jewish practice. In 1909, a group of independent-minded Orthodox Jews in North London made an approach to Victor Schonfeld of Hungary to become rabbi of a new synagogue, the Adath Israel. Schonfeld was keen to strengthen the practice of traditional Judaism, and in 1926 set up the Union of Orthodox Hebrew Congregations to allow like-minded independent synagogues to affiliate together. And by the early 1970s, the UOHC incorporated 40 affiliated communities comprising some 3,000 families. And it offered a point of affiliation for very Orthodox communities, which grew in number, as I've said, following the arrival of immigrants from communist Eastern Europe, many of whom were very pious, many of whom were Hasidim. The UOHC also came to represent the main seat of Orthodox Jewish learning in Britain, the Gateshead Yeshiva, as well as ultra-Orthodox Jewish communities in places like Stamford Hill and Broughton Park. Cooperation and collaboration within and beyond these organisations and groups was always limited, and this was a conscious and deliberate decision. Here, the most obvious example of what not to do was the United Synagogue. Solomon Schonfeld laid out this difference clearly in 1972, as he explained, and I quote, "Our first principle is divide and rule, and that's ourselves, not others. We have little centralization. You can't force real Jews to toe the line. Warm Orthodox Jews do not lend themselves to regimentalization," end quote. The principle of separation was inspired by the example of Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch, who had outlined the desirability of an Auschwitz-Gemeinde, a succeeded community in Germany in 1964, as an attempt to separate Orthodox Jews from a lax majority and thus to preserve an unadulterated Orthodox tradition. Describing themselves as a kind of successor community to Hirsch's, the Jewish Tribune explained in 1965 what Orthodox Jews saw in the principle of separation. To us, they said, our street is a spiritual wall, which is seen only by those who voluntarily seek its shelter, but remains completely invisible to those outside. On these terms, size doesn't matter. As an editorial in the Tribune explained in 73, it wasn't important whether an organization represented 17,000 or 7,000 families. What mattered was the safeguarding of principles. It would be wrong to dismiss this separate path as an abandonment of broader British Jewry. It isn't. Instead, it should be seen as an attempt to set uncompromising standards to pull British Jewry towards more traditional Jewish practice. For Bernard Homer, the arrival in Britain of more religious immigrants converted, and I quote, a semi-assimilated and religiously declining group of 65,000 into a thriving and virile community of nearly 500,000. Now, while that's a bit oversimplified, it's no doubt true that Orthodox groups pulled the British Jewish Centre, epitomised by the office of the Chief Rabbi, back towards stricter religious rules and practice. But this pull to the right wasn't the only pressure on British Jewry, or indeed the only pressure on the Chief Rabbi. For there were two significant centres of growth in religious Jewish communities in the post-war, both of which squeezed and threatened the unstable foundations of whatever the middle of the road Jew is. And just as Orthodox Jewry grew apace, so too did progressive Judaism, in the form of the liberal synagogue, sure, but more than anything in the form of Reformed Synagogues of Great Britain, the OSGB. In 1973, the rabbi of Northwestern Reform Synagogue, Dov Marmor, published an edited volume of essays on Reformed Judaism. This volume was designed to serve as a manual for those interested in Reformed theology, mindful that before that only pamphlets or shorter articles had appeared. Having grown rapidly in the post-war period, progressive Judaism found itself as a little bit as a faith without its own canon, without a body of thinking that stood as distinct from other Jewish theological writing. The problem, as we shall see, was that the development of reform had not really occurred as a specific theological intervention, at least in the first instance. The 19th century pioneers of Reform Judaism had been conservative in terms of their theological challenge, and weren't particularly inclined, unlike liberal Judaism that came later, to divert from traditional Jewish norms. In the post-war period, however, what was now a blossoming movement began to stake out new territory, narrate its own story. And Marmor's volume began with a history of the movement as told by Rabbi Michael Lee of Edgware and Canons Park Reform. Lee set out the foundations of Reform Judaism at the start of the 19th century, highlighting as a concrete starting point Season in Lower Saxony in 1801. In Britain, the first Reformed Jewish congregation opened in the West London Synagogue in January 1842, following a declaration in 1840 of disaffection with the status quo by 18 Sephardi and 6 Ashkenazi Jews who were fed up with aspects of their traditional services, with levels of decorum, the standard of Jewish education in their existing synagogues. And they soon employed Rabbi David Wolf's Marx from Liverpool to lead them. Marx held the view that the oral law shouldn't be considered as divinely given, an idea that fueled his personal readiness to engage with a new, more open-minded congregation, and which resonated with the same kind of scientific Jewish thinking that was becoming popular in Germany. Far from being a significant theological schism, the matter which in the end, though, drove the establishment of the Western was a Sephardi irritation at the refusal of their synagogue authority to allow them to establish a new synagogue away from Bevis Marks and closer to where they lived. In terms of theological change, it was only a modest pull away from orthodoxy. As Lee's history noted, the new synagogue didn't allow men and women to sit together until after 1919. It didn't incorporate an organ until 1859, and made only what he described as very meager changes to service. Nonetheless, the change was sufficient to lead to a joint denunciation of the new community by Sephardi and Ashkenazi authorities, which added up, Lee has argued, to a cherem. Yet, preceding the Second World War, relations between mainstream Orthodox communities and Reform had been okay. In 1878, United Synagogue authorities had sounded out the Reform about possibly joining back together, and while that didn't happen, it gives some indication of the limited distance between United and Reform leadership, who were, after all, very much bolstered by close family ties, literally. You know, these are Jews that move in the same circles to a great extent. More important, maybe, though, was what Kirschen and Romain have described as the tolerant liberal tradition of orthodoxy at the end of the 19th century. Generally, the instinct of British Orthodox leaders was to keep the community together and exercise discretion. In the 1940s, however, relations between Orthodox and Reform began to strain, and matters coming to a head over what Reform leaders perceived as Orthodox intransigence over the education of displaced children during the Second World War, which led to a breakaway gathering at the Midland Hotel in Manchester in 1942. Reform schools were keen to assert their own traditions and not to be cast out from communal thinking. Especially because a lot of the refugees that needed educating came from their tradition background. The 1942 meeting resolved to establish both an educational committee and a standing conference known as Associated British Synagogues, and evolved their name soon to the Association of Synagogues in Great Britain. The absence of the descriptor reform in the title highlighted the limits of agreement between these synagogues as to what was appropriate, and a broader disinclination to categorize themselves away from the center of Jewish practice. As Rabbi Reinhardt of West London argued in 1946, the progressive quality of Judaism was traditional and had always been inherent to its very nature. To adopt any label such as progressive was to invite the suggestion that our Judaism is not traditional. In 1958, the word reform was finally included in the group's name, as it renamed itself Reformed Synagogues of Great Britain. For Reformed Jews, it was acceptable and indeed necessary for people to look at their Jewish traditions and assess for themselves what was relevant to their lives and what was not. Founder Rabbi of the Bet Kalal Yisrael, congregation in North Kensington, which initially affiliated with Reform and then went on, I think, to affiliate with Liberal Judaism, Sheila Schulman, explained the process of her engagement with Jewish theology. She said, "We need to be both loving and critical. We need to make the text ours." For Jonathan Romain, Reform Judaism provided for Jewish people in this period a newly relevant way to engage with their ancient faith. Reform Jews, he argued, weren't rejecting Judaism. It's just that they wanted a format that was more akin to their new lifestyle and social involvement. Reform, he said, was rooted in tradition, open to change. Key here is the concept of progressive revelation, the idea that the wisdom of Judaism evolves with each generation and that everyone has a duty to make sense of faith for themselves. As Rabbi Lionel Blue explained, we are moderns, whether we like it or not, and we do not reach awareness by deducing from the past experience of others, but by inducing from our own present experience. Newly ambitious and in tune with certainly a subset of British Jews, Reform Judaism grew rapidly in post-war Britain. By 1992, the membership of Reform synagogues had grown by over 500% since its 1942 beginning, so that RSGB was, behind the United, the second biggest synagogue bloc in the country. For a movement that didn't set out to be radical, the contribution of Reform to British practice has been substantial. Armed with the ability to make greater changes to Jewish practice than Orthodox theology, it has enabled the training and placement of female rabbis and openly gay rabbis. Deep differences in Reform thinking and process ensured a different endpoint when it came to procedures around joining the community, most obviously rooted in Reform's more positive position on accepting those who wanted to join because their partner was Jewish. So far as the Orthodox Beth Din was concerned, wanting to marry a Jew or having indeed already married a Jew did not make a good rationale for conversion. Indeed, it was feared that taking a soft position on this particular issue might lead to more intermarriage, as couples knew the synagogue could make good their decision. For the Reform, however, marriage to a Jew, as long as it was backed up with a sincere desire to join the community, served as a good reason to be Jewish, one which was perhaps more likely to lead someone to maintain a Jewish life than if they had a personal theological desire for change. Taking a positive attitude towards those with Jewish partners who wish to convert, Reform leaders realized would potentially help to stem the flow of Jewish people from Judaism at a time when interfaith marriage was becoming more common. Here was a practical reason to take a different line to the Orthodox, rooted not so much in theology as in the realities of post-war British life. As one delegate from Northwestern Synagogue questioned in 1965, was it not better to accept proselyte for the purpose of marriage and to ensure that the children came into the fold, or to discourage the applicants who would doubtless all the same marry out the faith and then we lose them completely? As a result of these radically different positions, there was increasing opposition to the establishment of Reform congregations among some Orthodox people. As Glasgow sought to embed a Reform community, hostility from the local Orthodox leadership made things hard. A note from the Conference of the Associated British Synagogues in 1944 recorded that Glasgow's new communal rabbi had told a large audience that liberal and Reform synagogues were churches for Jewish Christians. These kind of slurs served to legitimize progressive communities, as did the Orthodox denial of basic Jewish services to Reform parishioners. Glasgow, for example, refused to allow Reform ministers to officiate at the Jewish burial ground, meaning that Reform congregates could only access Jewish burial conducted by Orthodox ministers. And local rivalries could be petty. In Hull, the Orthodox minister called an extraordinary general meeting at 3 days' notice to prevent his members attending a scheduled lecture by the Reform rabbi to which the whole community had been invited. For some Orthodox Jews, the abandonment of traditional rules in progressive Judaism put it beyond the pale. It was a religion, an editorial in the Jewish Tribune complained, which, quote, allowed its adherents to do everything they please and places no obligations on them whatsoever. You can eat treifa on Yom Kippur, you can refuse circumcision, marry out of the fold, and still be regarded as a good progressive Jew, end quote. Amid this perceived dereliction of duty, Reform Jews were sometimes cast as not Jewish at all. In the ASGB executive in 1957, a discussion took place about how to respond to teachers at the Orthodox London School Hasmonean, who had described people who practice Reform Judaism to their pupils as not being Jews. For some Orthodox Jews, what was called for was a complete ban on contact, especially at the level of rabbis. This push for complete separation posed significant challenges for those who sought to engage across the community, and most notably for the Chief Rabbi. Israel Brody, who had the role from 48 to 65, was generally regarded in Orthodox circles as being suitably skeptical towards progressives, but concerns rose about his successor, Emanuel Jakobowicz. While Jakobowicz was no doubt well respected as an Orthodox figure, he began to attract significant criticism because of his belief that it was appropriate to engage with progressive Jews on community matters beyond religion. So if you're campaigning for Israel, if you're campaigning against anti-Semitism, Soviet Jewry, interfaith relations, that sort of thing. One such attempt at a communal unity in 1979 saw the Chief Rabbi attend a solidarity event for Israel alongside progressive leaders, a decision which sparked a furious response in some Orthodox circles. A small group of religious leaders, including rabbinical heads of Britain's yeshivot, the leader of the UOHC's Beth Din, and the rabbis of Manchester's Maxachei Hadash and London's Adath Yisrael synagogues, collectively going under the name Emetht, published an advertisement in the Jewish Chronicle which congratulated the UOHC on having made a declaration that had fiercely criticized Jakobowicz's attendance at the event. The Emetht advert made it clear that for them, progressive Jewry was completely untouchable, and that any engagement with such Jews was an act against Judaism. They concluded, anyone who imagines that these dissenters can be brought into the fold by consorting with them is deluding himself and misleading others. To Jakobowicz, what the Emetht signatories had failed to understand was that British Jews expected him and expected the community more broadly to strive for unity and not for the kind of separation called for by Emetht. Come with me on any of my communal visits to the grassroots, he told one letter writer, and you'll find out that the chief recruitment agents for reform are the signatories of the recent pronouncement. Indeed, for most Jewish Britons, these kind of arguments seemed unnecessary and potentially dangerous. In an atmosphere where concerns about anti-Semitism persisted and where unity was needed to maximize support for Israel and Soviet Jewry, most didn't see the need for infighting like this. In all communities, engagement with Orthodox and progressive Judaism cut across families and cut across friendship groups. And for most, these were largely seen as a matter of personal preference, not as meriting ostracization or public argument. As Ben Azai put it in the Jewish Chronicle, you pay your membership fee and you sit through the service of your choice. The fault line between Orthodox and progressive Jews, with the Chief Rabbi rather stuck in the middle as an Orthodox leader seeking communal unity, came to a head most seriously in this period within the internal politics of the Board of Deputies. As progressive movements grew in size in post-war Britain, so too increased their desire to be given proportional and appropriate recognition within this body of British Jewish representation. The issue was brought to the board in the summer of 1970 in an attempt to amend Clause 43 of its constitution. This clause invested Jewish ecclesiastical authority solely in the Chief Rabbi and the Chacham, restricting the board to consultation with these offices when they needed a religious view. The proposed amendment held that reform authorities should also be consulted where a particular matter would affect their congregations. This amendment passed a simple majority of the deputies, but it failed to secure the 2/3 majority you needed to change the constitution. Opposition to change was fierce among representatives of Orthodox synagogues affiliated with the UOHC and the Federation. Councillor H.J. Lobenstein of the OHHC told the Jewish Tribune that no Orthodox Jew could, quote, give any recognition to a religion of convenience which has deserted the sanctity of our heritage. Here, the Chief Rabbi was caught in the middle, seeking compromise. The matter was, Jakobowicz felt, quote, largely artificial and risked diverting the community's attention from the more urgent challenges facing us. Board leaders sought a compromise, but by the following summer, RSGB and ULPS, the Liberal delegates, had reached a stage of exasperation where they threatened to leave the board unless a compromise could be agreed. Board leaders proposed such a compromise, so that the Chief Rabbi and the Chacham would remain the ecclesiastical authorities, but it would be recognized that the progressive community had their own religious leaders who could be consulted where matters affected them. But to the Orthodox bloc of deputies, this was not acceptable. For the president of the London Mexico Hadass, it was, quote, the thin end of the wedge. Today, he explained, they're asking for consultation. In 5 or 10 years, in 5 or 10 years' time, the demand will be for the inclusion of their rabbis among the ecclesiastical authorities of the board. When the compromise motion passed in October 1971, 80 Orthodox deputies resigned on behalf of their communities, although most, those associated with the Fed, came back in 1973 following further discussion. What was at stake here was really nothing less than the right way to be Jewish in the face of modernity. As British Jewish communities adopted radically different approaches to modern life, the Chief Rabbi tried to bridge the gap, but it wasn't easy. Perhaps more than any other, the core issue and the one most difficult to reconcile related to the God-given nature and thus the unchangeability of Jewish scripture. For traditional Orthodox Jews, the written and oral law came from God, and it was heresy to see things otherwise. Difference of opinion on this issue challenged relations between Orthodox and progressive Jews, but also caused significant conflict within traditional communities, most obviously in the Jacobs affair of 1961. This controversy saw Israel Brody, Chief Rabbi, decline to support the appointment as principal of Jews College of Rabbi Louis Jacobs. Jacobs had strong Orthodox credentials, and in 1960, he had taken up the post of moral tutor and lecturer of pastoral theology at Jews College in anticipation that he would be made principal after Dr. Epstein's retirement, after his predecessor's retirement. But in the event, Israel Brody refused to consent to the appointment, a refusal rooted in objections that had been raised to Jacobs' published work, most obviously his book, We Have Reason to Believe, from 1957. While this book had not been initially controversial, Jacobs recorded that Israel Brody had accepted a copy and had done so without the slightest objection. Concerns were later expressed at its openness to biblical criticism, and specifically to the idea that the written and oral law might not literally have been handed directly from God. This view Jacobs had initially considered was fully compatible with, and I quote, the somewhat tepid orthodoxy of British Jewry. Yet, as we have seen, British orthodoxy in this period was lurching to the right, so that the argument of we have reason to believe, not helped by Jacobs's cordial relations with reformers, were painted as heretical by some of the Chief Rabbi's advisors. After Jacobs's old post at the New West End Synagogue became vacant in 1964, his congregation attempted to appoint their old rabbi, only again for disagreement with Israel Brody to scupper the move. With support from over 300 members of his community, Jacobs broke away and established a new congregation, the New London, in the character Jeffrey Alderman has noted of the United Synagogue of pre-war days. Followed by a small number of further congregations, this evolved into Masorti Judaism's beginnings in Britain in the 1980s. In the context of the substantial growth of progressive Judaism and Orthodox Judaism in post-war Britain and the mounting hostility between the two, it is very tempting to see British Jews, as Alderman has done, as a house divided, with the Orthodox Chief Rabbi and the diplomatic United Synagogue officials attempting against the odds to bridge a widening divide. And to some extent, this is an argument that it's difficult to argue with this as a position. Yet for me, it doesn't quite tell the whole story. Of course, there was, and there remains, a seemingly unbridgeable divide between those who see the written and oral law as the word of God and those who don't. But in many ways, there has been much in common in the motivations and thinking of seemingly disparate Jewish religious communities. These communities, moreover, change shape and focus depending on the vantage point of your inquiry. Devotional differences that run within families and social groups can perhaps too easily obscure greater commonalities, which when considered might allow a different image of devotional British Jewry to come to the fore, different both in tone and substance from what one might imagine from the high volume disputes at leadership levels. Indeed, in many ways, devotional Jews across the religious spectrum still have quite a lot in common. For one thing, the contrasting beliefs and behaviours of Orthodox and Reform communities were rooted in the same anxiety, driven by a belief that they were the last defenders of Judaism, holding back a tidal wave of secularism and assimilation. Within Orthodox Judaism, Harman has noted, the level of existential angst about the continuing survival of Judaism and Jewish way of life was dominant. Believing traditional Jewish existence to be under threat at every turn, Orthodox Jews would cling to a rigid traditionalism and maintain a healthy distance from non-Jewish society in an attempt to ward off assimilation. Of course, the response from Reform Jews to fears about Jewish decline and assimilation were very different, but they grew from the same belief that Jews had to find a way to maintain their faith and their traditions in an atmosphere of growing secularism and assimilation. In both cases, this sense of responsibility was firmly rooted in a post-Holocaust determination not to allow a posthumous Nazi victory in the form of the disappearance of Jews and Judaism. This was, as the Jewish Tribune explained, quote, an orphaned generation of Jews, very much conscious of its spiritual and material weakness. For Hugo Gryn, the Holocaust had left unfinished business, and British Jewry was engaged in a process of healing which would take generations. For some Orthodox Jews, this meant retaining and even reverting to pre-Holocaust traditions as a deliberate act of recovery. So you'd revert to, say, pre-Holocaust traditions of Jewish dress in an attempt to get back to the way things were. At an institutional level, the creation of new religious seminaries, both Orthodox and Reform, were rooted in this desire to preserve and recreate. Leo Beck College, Ruth Cohen attested, was founded to replace the seminaries destroyed by the Nazis. And similarly, the expansion of colleges in Gateshead was explained in these terms as, quote, Torah centres to replace those in Europe whose loss threatened disaster for the whole of Anglo Jewry. Ultimately, both Orthodox and progressive communities felt worried about how to sustain themselves. In response, progressive communities, their response was, in Gryn's word, to reaffirm our commitment to the opening of our doors, an attitude which saw the modification of a range of policies and practices to make Judaism more appealing and inclusive. For Orthodox Jews, a different approach was taken to solve the problem. Here it was most often thought the remedy was to hold fast, not to bend to prevailing winds. By maintaining the highest level of religious observance, some Orthodox Jews saw their role as, quote, defending a small corner of spiritual territory of Judaism, maintaining a faithful remnant. In so doing, they honoured not only the lost generation of the Holocaust, but had the best chance, they thought, of inspiring the next one. In this anxious atmosphere, as Orthodox and progressive Jews engaged as what they similarly perceived as a battle for the Jewish future, they served, albeit not on purpose, a useful purpose to each other. To Reform Jews, their adaptability and inclusivity was presented as essential response to intransigent and closed-minded Orthodox attitudes which risked driving Jews out of the faith. For the Orthodox, the case of maintaining strict religious standards and preserving traditions was made repeatedly in terms of resisting the dangerous pressure being exerted on the centre by progressive Judaism. Yet, beyond using each other as bogeymen and beyond the very real divisions of thought and practice, this was, for the most part at least, a community which still recognised each other as family, however much they disapproved of each other's choices. On these terms, Orthodox insults about progressive Jews not being real Jews should be seen, in my opinion, as just that. Nasty words, as Gryn might have put it, designed to antagonise, yes, to rebuke, yes, but not intended ultimately as a statement of fact. British Jewry grew from multiple national, class and religious backgrounds, so that it had never been neatly comprehensible as one group. And that didn't change in the post-war period, but neither did the community come apart. Instead, the growth of progressive Judaism and Orthodox Judaism should be seen both in terms of the impact of long-term processes of immigration and as evolving responses to changing times, in which the identified problem, the decline of traditional Jewish community, was in many ways agreed on. Across and within families, Jewish practice varied, as had always been the case, but using these disparities and arguments as evidence of polarization foregrounds religious belief in British Jewish identity in a period in which Jews increasingly explained and understood their Jewishness in different terms. Ethnicity, culture, that sort of thing. For sure, some Jews bickered bitterly about religion and believed other Jews to be on the wrong path. Yet, for all but the most religious Jews in post-war Britain, relations with God and with formal religious organizations were increasingly personal, increasingly informal, and idiosyncratic. And I will leave it there. Thank you all, and I will take questions.
Thank you very much, Gavin. Very, very interesting. If you have questions for Gavin, please put them into the Q&A now, and we will put them to him. Do you think, sort of looking back over this period, you've mentioned that communal leaders might have acted differently? Do you think there were mistakes made along the way?
I think for sure. I think that you know, I think as I think I've said, that it depends who we're talking about. If we're talking about the Chief Rabbi, I think Chief Rabbis, I think unarguably have been pulled in both directions, and have maybe, you know, it's not for me to say whether they've made mistakes, I don't think, but just to say whether or not they've got things right depends on who's doing the pulling and what you think. Invariably, what's end up happening is that Orthodox communities to the right of them think they've yielded too much. Progressive groups to the left of them think that they haven't yielded anywhere near enough. The Jewish different parts of the Jewish press take different stances, and the Chief Rabbi is left to try and make their own decisions. I think in terms of synagogue officials and leadership of specific synagogue bodies, it's been, one has to recognize that there's been a degree of competition. I think people haven't wanted to lose ground. They want to maintain their communities. They believe that their communities are the right communities for people to be in. And so, sure, I think they probably could, and there should have been what the Christians would call, which a term that we don't tend to use as much, but more ecumenical work in terms of the unity of the Jewish whole. But I guess what the point of my paper is I think that's kind of lurking in the background. I think that there is more agreement generally than it looks like there is from these high profile disputes, that there's a lot of name calling in this period and a lot of genuine hurt. If you listen to that broadcast that I started the talk with, there's genuine hurt in that. There's no doubt about that. And you can listen to that, by the way. It's now on BBC Sounds. A lot of the You Don't Have to Be Jewish are now on BBC Sounds, and they make a great listen, just to plug that. You know, I think aside from the sound and the fury, there is an underlying degree of cooperation, not least because, as I've said a couple of times, a lot of times these people are still in the same family. You know,
the Chief Rabbi is an interesting animal, I suppose, for want of a better word, in that the Chief Rabbi's organization is pretty Haredi. The Beth Din, the Chief Rabbi oversees, is far more to the right than he is. I don't know if you have any comment on the relationship between the Chief Rabbi and his own court, as it were.
Well, I think if you look at the scholarship on this, and if you look at Freud Candle's work, or Elton's work, or Jeffrey Alderman's work, what you see is that this, or indeed Ann Kirshner and Jonathan Remains, you can see that there's a pulling to that in that direction because of the refugees. You know, there has been in an earlier period, you know, a more moderate a court, and I don't mean a court as in a Beth Din, but like a coterie of people around the Chief Rabbi, but that he does get significantly pulled to the right in the post-war, and I don't think that's a comfortable place for him to be. There's some nice correspondence where Jacobowitz says to some of his critics, basically, I paraphrase, it's not what he actually says, but he says, if you think that I'm not frum, you should see my predecessors, you know, that actually what I'm doing is maintaining a tradition and actually being moderate, but to a certain constituency, that wasn't enough. And I do think that the Chief Rabbi is seduced by that constituency because he sees in it authentic religious Jewry, which is what, you know, that's what he sees, and he doesn't want to displease it, and he doesn't want to alienate it, because at the end of the day, that is an orthodox position, isn't it? He's not the chief rabbi of all British Jews. He's the chief rabbi of the United Synagogue.
We have a question from Abigail Kaplan. What do you make of the idea that middle-of-the-road Jewry and leadership has been depleted by many of them going on aliyah, as well as falling birth rate amongst traditional Jewry, where previously many of these people would have gone on to support, run and lead such traditional communities?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think it lends itself to that polarization thesis, because what you'd say then is only more from people or you know, more activist people would stay in, and those kind of middle of the road Jews come away. I don't know whether it's, I wouldn't be quick to try and put my finger on it in terms of making aliyah or moving to Israel, however you want to term it, because, you know, what 40,000 British Jews have moved to Israel since the state's creation. It should have been a number that shouldn't have had a huge impact. Maybe it has had a bigger impact because of the kind of Jews that go, that it tends to be kind of activist Jews, leader Jews that go. But I mean, I would be very anecdotal if we talked about that. What I think is unarguable, and I would take from your point, is that fewer Jews are affiliating and attending shul, and that means that leadership will look a bit different one way or the other.
We have a question from Dr. Colin Lecce. I hope I've pronounced your name correctly, sir. There's been no mention about the controversy over the appointment of the chief rabbis.
No, and no, I understand that, and this is a bit of quick fire lecture. But as I say, I think what you can see in those appointment processes is this, and I don't know whether he'd agree, is the same kind of arguments coming into place about how frum, how learned the appointee is, as set against a more secular set of criteria, how representative, how communally acceptable, how British, and that those have been pressures that have governed chief rabbi appointments for sure.
And I suppose, of course, the chief rabbi has to be a spokesperson for the community with a message, a coherent message for people who aren't Jewish in this country as well. Sure,
and I think certainly, you know, that I don't want to I don't know enough to get embroiled in like the kind of minutiae of chief rabbi or biography, but what I would say is that I think it's unarguable that as the community has got as that kind of orthodox bloc has grown, the pressures on who is appointed for chief rabbi have changed.
Certainly. Tony Cohen asks about the Board of Deputies. You mentioned the Board of Deputies earlier. Does the Board of Deputies have relevance in this discussion? And I suppose, you know, I would add, well, does the Board of Deputies do a good job? Is it a force for unity, or is it a force for division? How do you see it?
Oh, well, as I say, I'm not picking fights with the chief rabbi. I'm not picking fights with the Board of Deputies either. I don't know. I mean, it's not an easy thing to do. Like when you begin to research British Jewry, like you come up at this problem of kind of, well, who does represent British Jewry? And it's tricky, because especially people who don't affiliate, who you know, who maybe don't even always identify, how can any one person represent that? The Board of Deputies, and somebody who knows better here will correct me if I'm wrong, are built from synagogue congregations who can then send deputies. And if your congregation's of a certain size, you can send deputies, and some other organizations too. And what I would say is, what else do you do? Like, you know, I know that there have been very, very recently some beef about how representative the Board of Deputies are. But what I would say is we're not an easy community to represent, you know, and attempts to do so almost always fall flat. And it's a burden that I feel trying to write this post-war history of British Jews, which, you know, which British Jews are you writing about, kind of thing. You know, it's not an easy community to represent for anybody. And whether the board gets things right or not, I would say is well beyond my expertise or inclination to call.
Well, that's probably a good point to pause our discussion. Gavin, thank you very much for being our guest this evening. To say thank you, we'll send you a book. This is some of my photographs of Magen David Adom, the Israeli ambulance service in action. So hopefully you'll enjoy that. And now just a few words about our upcoming program before we leave you. So next Monday, we're joined by the writer and sociologist Keith Carn-Harris, who's speaking about his book, What Does a Jew Look Like? I think we've explored that theme quite exhaustively this evening so far. The following week, on the 23rd of May, Jonathan Stone is our guest from America. We'll be discussing his comic novel, The Prison Minion, and the more serious messages his book contains. Then on the 30th of May, author and Ajax archivist Martin Sugarman will be telling us about the March of the Jewish Legion through London in February of 1918. We have many more speakers confirmed, so please do visit our website at milim.org.uk to book your tickets and make sure you sign up for our newsletter.
Jonathan, can I just can I say one more thing?
You can, with pleasure.
It's really weird to speak to a group of people you can't see, and I would have liked in a different circumstance to have seen you all. If any of you have got any thoughts on what I've said or have any feedback, I'd be always really welcome email correspondence, and you can look me up, but I'm g.schaffer@bham.ac.uk, and I'm sorry I'm not among you personally.
Thank you for that. People can sign up for our newsletter with pleasure. All of our events are free, but you can make a donation. There's a link in the chat if you want to give us your money, which will help to meet the costs of putting on these webinars. It remains for me to thank our guest, Gavin Schaffer, once again. Thank you so much, Gavin. It's been a pleasure to have you.
Thank you for having me. I've enjoyed it.
Thank you, and looking forward to seeing you all at a future event. Until then, stay safe. See you soon.